Good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to this webinar on on osteoporotic fractures and proton pump inhibitors. Is it a must? My name is Dr. Leslie Kalin. I'm a family nurse practitioner, and I'm so delighted to present this webinar for you. My very first webinar we did was on proton pump inhibitors and the adverse effects, osteoporotic fractures being one of those. And so it was a very good, comprehensive webinar that we went into. And for this webinar, I really wanted to focus on osteoporotic fractures related to proton pump inhibitors as an adverse effect, because it really is profound in terms of its effect on our patients, or for you patients that are out there, and it is quite substantial. So before I start on the webinar itself, I want to just do some housekeeping with the platform. In front of you, you'll see a couple of different windows open, and if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you should see a bunch of different tabs. Some are light, some are blue, white, some are grayed out. So I want you to have a couple of windows open on your screen. Of course, the one I want you to have is the PowerPoint presentation. It's a live view here. You will not be able to manipulate the slides. You'll have to just let me manipulate them for you, so just follow along with me. That will give you the material. The PowerPoint itself is not available, so if you want to write down some notes from the slides, or you want to take a photo of one of the slides that might be helpful, you can certainly do that, or you can request from us the slide deck, and we can certainly send that out. On that note, you should also have a resource window that's open that has my biography, a little bit about me and what I do, an email link where you can email me any questions that you might have about the slides, proton pump inhibitors, or any clinical questions in general. I'm always delighted to answer those questions for you. As well, there is a resource with just, gives you a little bit of information about the presentation, but not the PowerPoint deck itself. Also, you want to have your webcam open, or the view where you can see me speaking and hear me. Make sure that your volume is up if you can't hear me, if you just see my mouth moving. Also, you will want to eventually at some point open up your question and answer tab, and that's going to be for the question and answer at the end of the webinar. If you have a burning question that pops up during the webinar, feel free to send it to me at that in that link, or that window rather. But I will not be able to get to the question and answers until the end. I want to make sure I get through everything because it is a pretty in-depth slide deck today. All right, I think that's about it for the platform. You should also see actually survey. This is new, I think, from the last webinar, where we actually have a survey window that's up for you to complete. Complete it at the end if you can, so we can get some accurate information from you about your experience with the webinar. If you complete the survey, and I'll remind you again at the end, if you complete the survey, we will be doing a draw, which will be electronic after the webinar, of a Margaret Fitzgerald course. So many of you nurse practitioners out there, nurses, are very familiar with the Fitzpatrick courses and the study manuals, probably from certification in your exams. You know her. So we're giving away one of her courses. I believe it's an hour and a half. So please fill out the survey, and you might just be that lucky one who wins that awesome course. Okay. I think that's about wrapping up for the platform and the housekeeping. If I think of anything else, I might just chime in the middle. But let's get started on osteoporotic fractures and proton pump inhibitors. I'm going to start talking with you first about our bones, since that's exactly where osteoporosis forms. So the bones are light, strong, flexible structures. Most people, when they think of bones, they don't automatically think that they're light. They don't really think that they're flexible. We certainly know that they're strong, but what makes them flexible is the collagen that actually surrounds the bone itself and keeps that shape, that architecture Okay. And that actually is part of that flexibility, is that collagen is very soft, it is flexible, and so when you get some stress or you get some trauma, that is not just sort of a protective area, but it's also gives some mobility in terms of it not chipping the bone right off the bat. So that's part of the flexibility part of bones. They're light in the sense that they're not completely solid all the way through. They're actually quite porous. Think of like those pumice stones you use to scrub all that, dead cells on the bottom of your feet to make those nice smooth heels. So the pumice stone is a really good example actually because it's fairly light. Obviously you can't, you can scrub your foot with it, so it's light enough, but it's also porous. Okay, so that's really what the bones are. If they were really fully dense, we certainly could not do the functions like locomotion. Could you imagine how much muscle we would need if we had to move with solid bones, like a steel rod, essentially, or something heavy like that? So the functions of the bones obviously are for locomotion, for moving. They help support the body and protect the structure. So we have our sternum and our rib cage that protect our heart and our lungs. They are for calcium deposit, so it helps actually for storage, as well as it being a part of how it's integrated and what forms it. It's actually also a storage facility too for calcium and some other minerals. It also harbors bone marrow, of course, which is very important for our cells. The bones are dynamic, meaning they're very active. They're growing all the time. So there's a remodeling process that happens. About 10% of all of our bones every year go through remodeling. So this doesn't happen until adulthood. So in the first years, the formative years, we're growing. The growth plates are growing. We don't have this remodeling. It's really focused on bone growth. The remodeling process happens once those bones reach their maximal height, depth. They're adult. They're stopped growing per se, and then we start the maintenance. Really, we're doing maintenance. The body does this maintenance 10% every year. So this remodeling is really a mixture of a couple of different phases, but the two phases I'll be talking about in a little bit more depth here are the resorption and the formation phases, which incorporate the osteoclast, osteoblast, osteocytes, and the bone lining cells. So osteo, of course, refers to bone, and then the other part of it, of the word, will represent what its job is. And so I'll go into a little bit more of that here individually. This is a really good slide here if you want to take a quick photo of this or a screenshot for you to save. It really kind of explains the whole entire remodeling process in one simple picture. So I want you to look mostly at the resorption and the formation phases, which is the second and the fourth. And you'll see here in the essentially, let's do a little overview. So we see in the middle, crossing the resorption, reversal, and the formation, there's a convexity in the bone. Okay, so it should be nice and flat. Then what we see is this sort of convex or concave, depending on which way you're looking at it, this dip essentially in what we're representing as the bone. So in the resorption, we see the red cells with those 4 black dots in there. Those are the osteoclasts. So let's imagine that this bone here is a construction site, okay? The osteoclasts are the diggers. They're the ones that are digging this hole. They're saying, okay, it's time for us to dig this basement. We've got to do this remodeling. So start taking out all of that old calcium, that old bone, so we can start getting some fresh material in there. So the osteoclasts are triggered. They're going to start digging and removing. They're going to start building this, or digging this hole rather. The osteoblasts, which are the green circles with the little black kind of ovals in the middle in the formation, those are the builders. So I always remember the osteoblasts. The blasts are the builders. Okay, so they build. They're in there after we've done all the digging. The osteoblasts get activated to do the building. You see here that there are some in the bone matrix, which is the underneath part. There are these little cells that are kind of helping regulate. Those are the osteocytes. So their job really is, think of it as the foremans. They're the ones sort of telling the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts what to do. They are, they basically help with regulating them both, the activity of them, but they are derived from the osteoblastic cells. So this, I just went through each one of them here. The bone lining cells, which really line the top, so right where, before we saw that convexity, they line with the collagen. They are very much on the top. So think of them as the executives that own the company, okay, own the construction company. They're making sure that nobody's digging when they shouldn't be digging and nobody's building when they shouldn't be building, okay? The foreman isn't telling them what to do. Everyone is resting when they're supposed to be resting and active when they're supposed to be acting. So the bone lining cells essentially they protect the osteoclasts, so those digging bones, from penetrating into the matrix when they're not supposed to. Okay, that's really what they're doing. So it's a really good way to think about it as a construction site, and that there's people or cells that are regulating that whole process. This is just a really nice sketch of from the top part of a bone, could be a femur, at how that activity might look in a little bit more pseudo-realistic way. So what's the composition of the bones? So the bones are really comprised or composed of inorganic and organic material. So when we think of inorganic, don't think of it as, like organic food or non-organic food. What it is, which is probably the most common analogy that we could come up with. So an inorganic component simply means, when we're talking about the body, is that it's really at its most basic. It's really not, it's not dynamic in nature. There's no breaking down. It can't be broken down any further. It just kind of exists. It's there. It's deposited or it's not deposited. And then when it's not deposited, it can be, built into something else. So the organic components make up about 60% of the bone, and they are the crystals, the hydroxyapatite crystals, which are basically a formation of the minerals that make the bone matrix, the matrix being the inside of the bone. That collagen is mostly on the outside. So that is, the organic material is mostly on the inside. Just dense, it just sits there, doesn't really do much except go into the bone or out of the bone. The organic components are mostly the proteins. We find a lot of those, or most of those, around the exterior. We do see some of them within the bone at certain points. But this is the collagen, the osteocalcin, the bone sialoprotein, osteonectin. These are basically proteins, and so they're organic because proteins can be broken down. They're involved in the enzymatic processes. They're a little bit more migratory. They can come in and out a little bit more readily. So that's just what makes them organic. The bone metabolism involves a lot of different nutrients. So the main ones I'm going to be really touching on are going to be the ones highlighted there in blue. Calcium, magnesium are really the most important that I want you guys to ingrain into your memory. The other ones are sort of additional. So now let's talk about calcium homeostasis. So we know the bone is made up mostly of calcium, and so it's really the one mineral or element that is responsible for bone density, which is really what osteoporosis and the fractures that result from that revolves around. And so we'll get to that a little bit later. So calcium homeostasis occurs from a balance of all these different functions in the body. Okay, so we need to have the calcium first available in the body to be able to even have to exist in the homeostasis. So food needs to be ingested for us to extract the calcium from. And in order for that to happen, the gastric pH in the stomach needs to be at an appropriate level in a natural, healthy person to be able to make that calcium in the food removed, so to make it soluble. Absorption happens in the intestine. Of course, that calcium needs to, be able to get into the body. And then, of course, it's excreted. So if there's any excess ever, the body will excrete it through the kidneys. And then Also, any excess can be stored into the bones or used when it's growing or there's fractures, remodeling processes occurring, etc. Calcium really should be between the 1.1 and 1.3, 1.4 it says on this slide, in order for those mechanisms to be sort of quiet. Of course, these processes are going all the time, the excretion, the absorption, the breaking down of calcium so it can be absorbed. They're always functioning, but the body is always trying to keep that calcium level the same all the time. And for these very, very important reasons. Calcium isn't just important for the bones and for bone health. There are many other reasons that our body needs calcium. So storage is really important because calcium is involved in signal transduction. So what that means is calcium is involved, one of the places that calcium is really involved in this transduction is actually in activation of enzyme processes within each cell. So when calcium is brought into a cell through the cytoplasm and through the whole process within the cell, it actually activates enzymatic processes. And other proteins are involved in that. So it actually is a signal. It also causes neuronal activation. So a really good, easy place for you to think about this is in that AV node, the AV node in the heart, that actually signals the electrical conduction of that impulse to make the heart contract. So that's an electrical conduction or neural activation. Calcium is involved in that conduction of the AV node. It's also responsible for muscle contraction. So not only will it cause the electrical conductivity that creates the muscle contraction, it's also there causing that muscle contraction itself. Hence calcium channel blockers. So calcium channel blockers can pace rhythm, but it's also mostly used for the contractility, to augmenting the contractility of the heart. For those of you who are very familiar with calcium channel blockers. Furthermore, with the calcium homeostasis, we have calcium and phosphate that are converted into that hydroxyapatite salt, which is really how it's deposited into the bones. This really functions as a mechanism to keep the bone strong. It gives it that architecture. It does have some other functions with other ions, but it's really in the bones for creating that strength. In terms of the intestines and the absorption, really the majority of the absorption of calcium, whether it's in soluble or an insoluble form, is done in the colon and the ileum. The duodenum does have some involvement, but to a lesser degree, and it really depends on how deficient the body is. There was an article I read just recently, some research I was reading recently, just about what type of activation, what type of calcium mechanism is used, or absorption mechanism is used in the different parts of the intestine. And actually the duodenum, because of the mechanism that it absorbs calcium, it absorbs less. So in that next point there, when we're talking about that, the active saturable process versus the passive unsaturable process, the active process of calcium absorption really does actually take place in the duodenum. It's more intense, where there's more pieces to the puzzle in terms of getting calcium absorbed. There has to be some calcium binding proteins in order for it to be actively absorbed into the duodenum. Whereas in the ileum and the colon, calcium is really, it's more passive. It just goes through almost like an osmosis, where it's going into the bloodstream much more readily, with really very minimal need for all of this, drama, all of these proteins and everything to, push the calcium into the cells or in through the lining to be absorbed. So here are some very important elements, hormones, vitamins that are involved in regulating calcium homeostasis. So I'm going to go through each one of them. This is probably going to be very interesting and new for a lot of you, even those clinicians that are experienced. Because who really, would have thought that calcium had so many hormones and minerals or vitamins that would would regulate it. So vitamin D is the first one. Basically, vitamin D is, we get it from, it's in our skin, but it's activated through the ultraviolet rays. So when the sun beats down on us, it's activated through the skin, and then it's available. What it does directly to help calcium absorption is basically by facilitating that through the intestine. So it helps basically with the calcium to transport. So if you have enough calcium but you don't have any vitamin D, you're really not going to be able to absorb as much calcium as you should. It's just, one of those transporters that is necessary to help facilitate that passive absorption. So this isn't the active, but this is the passive absorption of calcium through the ileum and the colon. It does also affect how calcium is excreted through the kidneys. So when you have vitamin D, less of the calcium is going to be excreted, even if there is enough calcium. If there's too much calcium, I should say, in the bloodstream, vitamin D will actually blunt that effect and help route that to be actually stored in the bones versus excreted. And so again, vitamin D helps with that calcium binding, like we had talked about earlier. Vitamin D also stops the parathyroid gland from secreting parathyroid hormone, which I'll talk a little bit about next. So really, vitamin D has a pretty substantial effect on preventing osteoporosis when it's in ample amounts. So parathyroid hormone is secreted from the parathyroid gland, and what it does essentially is it's released when there is, it's basically, it modulates, it's one of those hormones that helps modulate the calcium levels in the serum. So it's not generally one that we like to have. We want to have a lot of calcium available that's going to be deposited. We really don't want anything disrupting that level of 1.1 to 1.3 for the calcium. We don't want generally any calcium to be removed from the bones because we don't want our bones to be thin, but sometimes when that homeostasis of calcium is off, there has to be something that will go into our reserves and take that calcium out. So calcium in the bones is like our savings account. We don't want to go in there. We don't want to touch our savings, but sometimes under very, very extraneous circumstances, we have to go in and touch that savings. And so the parathyroid hormone is that emergency where it's going in and it's making us have to touch our savings. So it's going into the bones and removing the calcium, and that's in response to low calcium levels. So in order to get that calcium level up, it has to go somewhere, and it's going to go to the bones and remove it there. This is a nice little picture. You can take a snapshot of this too if you want to, and you can reference it if you'd like. But it just talks about sort of the mechanism here of parathyroid hormone and how it affects the calcium. Essentially, it causes the potassium to be excreted from the kidneys, which will help resorb calcium, again, to elevate the calcium levels in the serum. It does induce a little bit of synthesis of vitamin D, which is good, so it'll help with that absorption as well. But the problem with the parathyroid hormone is, like I said, in long term, it becomes catabolic, meaning it will start eating away at the bones to make the serum levels elevated so that the other functions, the nerve conduction, the muscle contraction, the signaling can occur. In short doses, however, of parathyroid hormone, it actually can be anabolic, meaning we're going to be depositing some calcium into the bones. So it's a little seeming paradoxical, but our body knows how to function, or at least it thinks it knows how to function. And so we can actually use this sometimes in treatment of osteoporosis. We can use these little minute amounts of parathyroid hormone, but we won't be talking about the treatment of osteoporosis too much today. Calcitonin is the opposite of what parathyroid hormone does. It's also an opposite gland. So instead of the parathyroid, it's actually secreted from the thyroid gland, and it's in response to high levels of calcium. So when there's elevated calcium levels, we want that calcium to go somewhere else because we don't want, too much calcium can be bad as well in the bloodstream. So this actually helps shunt the calcium to the bones into other places to help excrete it as well through the kidneys. But this is the hormone that we really like. We want more calcium in the bones so we have nice, strong, healthy bones and also reserves. Thyroid hormone really doesn't do a whole lot in and of itself when it's just at its normal. But when we have an excess amount of thyroid hormone, as in hyperthyroidism, then we can start having some dysfunction in that homeostasis. So in and of itself, it doesn't have a substantial amount to do with regulation of calcium, somewhat through the vitamin D and the absorption through the intestine, but really we see its effect when it's out of its reference range. So when we have too much thyroxine circulating, we'll have higher calcium levels, higher turnover, and really that's because of the metabolism. So the metabolism goes up. So when people have hyperthyroidism, they're skinnier, they have racing heart, sometimes palpitations, hot sweats. They just cannot get cool because their metabolism is just racing. They really can shrink away to nothing, as opposed to hypothyroidism, which is the opposite. So if you think about how active those cells are, you basically end up having these cells that are going, even at the bone level. So we have more of this remodeling that might take place as well. But also, let me go back. Also, what can happen is with the thyroid hormone, it actually can activate parathyroid hormone too in small amounts. As we talked about, that can actually cause calcium to be taken out of the bones and into the circulation. Estrogen, all of our females out there, it's our best friend, right? So estrogen has direct stimulation of the osteoblasts. So on that construction site, estrogen's going in there saying, go osteoblasts, build that bone. So, and there's a couple of mechanisms of how estrogen actually does that. But the problem is, of course, which is our classic for you nurse practitioners, clinicians out there, for the calcium to be homeostatic in the bone, to stay where it is, we want to have our estrogen, but we don't always get that in menopause because naturally our estrogen levels drop. So our classic patient is that we think about with osteoporosis, which we'll get to, is that female who's postmenopausal simply because of this estrogen factor. Of course, there are other factors, but this is really the big one that causes the osteoporosis formation because estrogen has such a substantial effect on the bone. So when estrogen is no longer present, as in menopause, or at least in dismally low sometimes levels, you're not having that stimulation of the osteoblasts. So the osteoclasts, the diggers, remember, they go unopposed. So you have the remodeling of the bone, which is the resorption without the formation. So that's why when we do estrogen therapy with postmenopausal women, it's also protective for the bones and actually can rebuild the bone tissue itself. And estrogen does have some effect on the vitamin D, which helps resorption in the intestine. Testosterone does not have any direct effect on the bones. It increases bone mass, but it's through the aromatization to estrogen. So what that means is testosterone is actually converted to estrogen when it's necessary. So, of course, men have a lot more testosterone than women, which can certainly explain a lot of their metabolism and their bone health. However, estrogen, there is some internal signaling that happens in male tissue that triggers testosterone to be converted into estrogen through this aromatization. Now, when men go through andropause, they can have osteoporosis as well. Not maybe as significant as women, depending, of course, on how low their testosterone levels are. But this andropause really is because of DHEA, which is that prohormone or the precursor to testosterone. So without DHA, it won't be as much testosterone. Without testosterone, there won't be enough aromatization to estrogen, which means bone thinning and unopposed osteoclastic activity. This is one of the last slides on the hormones. The glucocorticosteroids, long time we've known that it is directly responsible for bone demineralization. So any of our patients that are on glucocorticosteroids, so prednisone, methylprednisolone, which is used to treat an array of diseases. And I'm talking here long term. We're not talking just, a dose of prednisone for, let's say, a sinusitis or, an eczema flare or something like that. We're talking really that long-term treatment. We're going to have some thinning of the bones. The mechanism can affect the absorption of calcium, although to a lesser effect because of the anti-inflammatory effects that it has in the bowels. Of course, aging, I won't go into each one specifically, but really as we get older, all of these functions can become dysfunctional. And so the dysregulation, just because of the aging process, can cause any one of these hormones or minerals to create their dysfunction through their mechanisms. This slide just talks about the specific ones that are most profound and common. So I'll talk just a little bit about osteoporosis here. Osteoporosis essentially is the thinning of the bones, okay? It's that little pumice stone that ends up dissolving over time, and those holes get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the bone on that, the photo there on the screen shows a little bit of what basically ends up happening. And so it causes a demineralization, so the bone density actually decreases. And we can determine someone's bone strength or bone health, their density, through screening. There's DEXA scans, and so you can certainly, as responsible clinicians, refer to the guidelines if you don't know already about the risk factors for that would make you want to screen someone sooner than is recommended currently. Osteoporosis is, of course, asymptomatic. You will develop a fracture more likely when you have osteoporosis because the bones are brittle, they're more porous, but you won't experience any pain by just having it until a fracture occurs. Of course, the most common sites of the fracture are the spine, hip, wrist, and ankle. Let me just go back to this one slide here. So the hip fractures, for you nurse practitioners and nurses out there, hip fractures are a really huge problem. In the elderly population, falls can be very common because of the disequilibrium, the gait changes, the dizziness, syncopal episodes from, low blood pressure as a side effect to, too tight control and blood pressure. For whatever reason, falls are common in elderly, and as a result of falls, we tend to have a high rate of hip fractures. 1 in 5 people who suffer hip fractures, so this is elderly, will actually it'll end up being fatal. So a hip fracture is so important to prevent. We, as clinicians, we need to be very diligent about our education with our patients, especially screening for osteoporosis and, understanding things like this, that proton pump inhibitors can affect or create an osteoporotic environment, because this hip fractures can still cause fatalities. And the reason for that is because the blood supply is disrupted when a hip fracture occurs, because of the layup time from healing and whatnot. They're prone to blood clots and pneumonia as a result. So those two, have very high incidences of mortality, and that's the correlation there. So osteoporosis in itself may not be a motivating factor for you to, want to consider, being alert to proton pump inhibitors and the effects on osteoporosis, but it's the complication associated with osteoporosis, which really is the fracture and the fatality, the mortality that can come from that. So let's talk a little bit about some of the adverse reactions of proton pump inhibitors specific to osteoporosis development. So proton pump inhibitors are those medications out there that we use for gastroesophageal reflux, peptic ulcers, to treat H. pylori as part of triple and quadruple therapy. They have been around for a couple of decades already, very widely used, widely advertised. I still see them on commercials. We prescribe them in prescription strength, which are just, generally, give or take, double what the over-the-counter doses are, but there's many over-the-counter medications of proton pump inhibitors. They are in the top 20. They were in the top 10, and they're now in the top 20, but still, going strong after 20 years or so on the market. So very widely accessible, widely used. Patients can self-medicate with them without us clinicians even knowing, which can pose a problem, simply because of the adverse effects of them. So this is a good photo that you can take a screenshot or a photo of for your records if you want, released for now. So this goes through the specific adverse reactions, which I basically talked very in depth with in the last webinar. So if you want more information on these specific adverse reactions, you can reach out to me via email, and I can always send you that slide deck, or we can maybe get you the webinar video if you'd like to see me speaking about that. But again, the one we're talking about today is the osteoporotic factors. And this is here just in another slide format. So how does it happen? Why do proton pump inhibitors create all of these processes? We thought that they were safe. We've used them for forever. Who would have thought that proton pump inhibitors could have all of that? Well, it's really because of the pH gets disrupted. So to go through a little bit about proton pump inhibitors and their mechanism briefly, proton pump inhibitors essentially elevate the gastric pH. So a pH, normal gastric pH in the stomach, should be about 1.3, 1.2, 1.3 on a 0 to 14 scale, or really it's more close to 1, but it's 0 to 14. 7.4 is about where is neutral, so that's where the serum, the blood, is at. Essentially, it's neutral. So proton pump inhibitors elevates the pH to 5. That's 2 points away from neutral. It's really, really not very acidic in comparison to what its natural state is. Now, proton pump inhibitors only shut off about 75% of the proton pumps. So we will never, ever get it to like a super basic, over 17, where we're, counteracting completely the acidity. So they're not that potent where it'll completely neutralize it, but 5 is still a substantial increase. And so when we don't have the gastric pH low enough, then we can't extract the minerals and the nutrients from food. And that's really what it is. We cause a malabsorption, a malnutrition, because of the inactivation or the removal of these minerals from food. That's really how it goes. So the FDA, going through the fracture risk, the FDA started investigating back about 10 years ago. So, before 2010, it was probably about 2008. I remember really reading a lot about it. They were looking at the post-marketing data of a lot of different medications after they've come on the market to see what are these effects. They started to see that what was seen in the studies, the research trials of meds before they were on the market, the pharmaceuticals, that they were getting a lot more of these adverse reactions and complications and cascades after the meds were on the market. And so they found with proton pump inhibitors and some of the other antacids and heartburn medicines that they would cause fracture risk, so particularly hip, wrist, and spine fractures. Proton pump inhibitors most substantially simply because they're the most effective. I mean, when you look at the guidelines for GERD and H. pylori and peptic ulcers, proton pump inhibitors are your go-to. I mean, they used to suggest H2s, so your ranitidines, but really the proton pump inhibitors are that gold standard because they're just so darned effective. But they're so darned effective because of what I said, and of course then they have the substantial nutrient malabsorption as a result. So that's where, something like a ranitidine or a TUMS might be a little bit more appropriate in some ways, simply because it doesn't have a substantial effect on the absorption, not as effective, but you have to weigh your pros and your cons there in terms of the absorption. So this is some risk stratification here. So the relative risk of spine fracture is about 58%, and the others are 33%. This is from proton pump inhibitors, so it's pretty substantial. Here's another photo op for you all to take here of a couple of articles that I thought might be helpful for you if you want to do some reading up on proton pump inhibitors specifically. So take a little screenshot of that. I'm not going to go into each one in detail, but just some easy or not so easy academic reading for you. So again, the osteoporotic fractures happen because we're not getting that calcium extracted from food into its soluble form or insoluble for it to be absorbed into the body. If it's not absorbed in its forms, it really can't be used for bone deposition or any of the other mechanisms that calcium is needed for in the body. Hypomagnesemia is something that I wanted to talk about too. Magnesium isn't as involved in osteoporosis directly. It is affected by proton pump inhibitors, but I felt that it was important to bring up because there is some growing literature on the connection. So again, the FDA had found that proton pump inhibitors can cause low magnesium. And when we have low magnesium, our patients are more likely to have muscle spasms, irregular heart rates, convulsions, and seizures. So these are things that you certainly want to be aware of if you have a patient who has any one of these conditions, that you can have a flare-up of them if you're on a proton pump inhibitor, especially the higher doses. So be wary of that. We certainly don't want to have that low magnesium level as a result of being on chronic PPI use. This slide basically just shows specifically the literature on it, but I do want to sort of point out that magnesium has effect on the absorption. It also helps with deposition with calcium. So magnesium really has been in more recent years linked directly with osteoporosis and the development of fractures. It's more growing, and I was going to include a slide here on that, but the literature is still sort of fresh and new, and I wanted to make sure I had a really good combination of articles for you, which isn't quite out yet. We still need some more time to assimilate the information, but this is really becoming more and more of an issue, a mineral that we're looking at with osteoporosis. So not only can it happen just in and of itself and cause issues with the muscle contractions, but it actually is linked to osteoporosis as well, specifically. And again, the mechanism for hypomagnesemia to happen with proton pump inhibitors is again from that extraction. When the pH level is too high, you can't make magnesium available to be absorbed. So what is it that we do with proton pump inhibitors when our patients are on them chronically? Like I said in my last webinar, as responsible clinicians, we go to the guidelines. We have to use them at times because they're that good, and sometimes that's the only effective thing. We can do on-demand treatment. We can use others. We can pulse between, ranitidine and H2 versus a PPI. There's non-pharmacologic measures that we can use. I believe there's papaya extracts. There are some other things. I don't know the efficacy of those alternate treatments, but there are some out there for perhaps the lesser symptoms of GERD or peptic ulcers. Or you can do nutritional supplementation to counteract. Use the proton pump inhibitors as you please, as the patients need, without needing to balance all of this other pulsing and diet and all that sort of thing, which a lot of our patients, when they have GERD, they just, they're eating bad foods. American population is, obese. 66% is obese or overweight. So that oftentimes that education isn't going to, really get translated into their day-to-day life. So they eat their food, they're happy on their PPIs, chronic use. You can use nutritional supplements to avoid these adverse reactions. It's a very plausible and likely alternate. So this is where the supplement proton support can really come in. I know from my own clinical experience, patients they're very rigid. They want to do what they want to do. They love their food. They want to eat what they want to eat, and they want to stay on their PPIs. As much as I'd like to give them alternates, and I try, it's sometimes just unavoidable. It's just really unavoidable. So what do I do? Okay, as a clinician, I can monitor their labs, make sure that their electrolytes and vitamins and everything are working well, their hormone levels are okay, but there's only so much that you can do until they start becoming deficient. And so proton support is a great supplement that can actually help prevent these adverse reactions from happening. So essentially, proton support is a combination of all the different minerals and vitamins that proton pump inhibitors will create deficiencies in. The added benefit is that it also has normal intestinal flora. So the probiotics mix into it as well. So it's really the only product that incorporates the nutrients with a probiotic all at the same time. The only product really of its kind that actually works to counteract the adverse effects of a pharmaceutical. So it's very unique and very effective to balance everything out as a preventative mechanism. I've had clients and patients and clinicians ask me if it can be used as a treatment. It certainly can as a supplementation to that, but the recovery would be a little bit longer because of the doses, and I'll go into the doses shortly. So it can be, I wouldn't necessarily recommend fully, depending on the level of deficiency somebody has. Of course, if they're critical, you're not going to want to put them on something that will correct them much quicker. But I have used it in treatment, but I use it primarily in the prevention of, or in very, very minute deficiencies. So the calcium component of the proton support, it's very unique because it has calcium citrate malate, which if you go to any of the supplement stores or just your local Walgreens or Albertsons pharmacy section, and you look in the back of the bottles, you'll see citrates, malates, oxides, or whatever at the end of an element. So the calcium citrate malate in this case. The calcium or calcium carbonate, calcium citrate malate is one of the most soluble forms of calcium. It's 9 times more soluble than the citrate and the malate, which is what you really commonly see in the over-the-counter vitamins. So it provides so much more available calcium, and it's not dependent on gastric pH. So you could have your level of 5 pH that's not going to penetrate that food, but you take this supplement, this proton support, and that calcium is going to be absorbed no problem without the gastric pH needing to be adjusted whatsoever. And so it provides 250 milligrams of calcium citrate malate, which is equivalent to the 250 milligrams of calcium, like the elemental that you will be able to, that's soluble and your body can use. So it's a nice, modest amount to help prevent the effects of PPIs. The vitamin D3, which helps with the absorption of calcium, it's 800 units, which is the recommended daily dose. So it's a really nice, appropriate dose of vitamin D. Easy to absorb. There's really no adverse or no worry about the vitamin D not being absorbed because it's not dependent on the gastric pH. The magnesium is the same. It's absorbed very, very readily. It's available in its form. It doesn't have to be conjugated. And the magnesium oxide is 5 times more available or soluble than the magnesium citrate, again, which is very common in a lot of the over-the-counter vitamins and supplements that you can see. And so the 100 milligrams of magnesium oxide is, again, it's a nice modest amount. It's not overdosing. It's not underdosing. It's just a really nice amount that helps keep the levels optimized to counteract the effects of PPIs. B12, it's free-form flowing. It is synthetic, but it does need to be a synthetic form for it to be free flowing and more easily absorbed into the GI tract. If you remember a little bit when I talked from the webinar before, and there's intrinsic factor that's dependent on vitamin B12 absorption. There's different things. So the synthetic piece of it is really important because of that absorption factor. And it provides 100 micrograms of B12. Again, nice modest dose. Iron is not one of the minerals that really affects osteoporosis, but again, I wanted to cover everything or most of the elements that are in the proton support, so you have an understanding of it. This really helps with other pieces, the other adverse effects that PPIs can have. Iron particularly is really to help with the adverse effects of the diagnosis in which we're using PPIs for. So if you have a bleeding ulcer, iron levels will go down, and so this will also help counteract that as your patients are on their H. pylori treatment or they have stomach ulcers, to just help give a nice easy amount of iron without that constipation effect. It's 80 milligrams, which is what's recommended by the FDA for your daily intake. So you should not have any of that constipation. You'll have your elemental iron in there in the appropriate daily doses. Vitamin K can help with the osteocalcin formation, so it will help with that bone metabolism. It also helps with some other adverse effects associated with PPIs. And again, it's 100 micrograms. So proton support is, I'll go through this slide here about the loyalty program. But I want to talk a little bit too, while I hold you here, about the product in itself. So proton support is made in the United States. So it's nice to have a product that is in your backyard for those of you who are broadcasting with me from the United States. The bottle kind of looks like this. I took the cap off. You get 60 capsules. You take 2 a day. They're not too big. I take these with ease. They look like that. They've got the really nice capsule. They're very soft, so your body can break it down very easily in these little capsules. So tablets, which a lot of vitamins over the counter, even some of the prescription vitamins that you get, are tablets. Tablets are extremely hard to absorb. I've been looking at the literature from the Consumer Report website you can look at, that looks at the solubility, the absorption ability of a lot of different multivitamins. Actually, you can compare pretty much most of the trending brands in the United States, and 3 to 5% of some of the nutrients in these multivitamins are actually going to be available and absorbed into the body. That's very dismal, just because of the preparation. So just because it's a vitamin or a mineral doesn't mean that it's going to be in that form, that soluble form, or in a type of form that your body's going to not only absorb, but then also be able to utilize once it's in the bloodstream. So again, with the proton support, their preparations, the compounds in which they make these minerals and vitamins soluble, is really active, so they can be absorbed and bioavailable in the bloodstream for that homeostasis and to prevent the adverse reactions. That's the one big piece that I wanted to communicate. There is also the normal flora. And so one of the things that I found with this product, which is so fun for me to hear about, but also for my patients, is that they start becoming regular with their bowel movements because of the normal flora. So if you remember the commercial, one of the yogurt commercials that had the probiotics in it, there was some 1-week challenge, and after that you'll be regular. That really is, it's the probiotic component of the yogurt. And so that's what ends up happening when my patients are on this for 3 to 5 days. They're, oh my gosh, I'm regular and I feel good and I'm light and that sort of thing. So that's a really nice, adverse effect of it. And some of my patients are on pain meds, or they don't drink enough fluid because we're here in the desert. And so they battle with constipation. And this is a really nice added. You can take off your stool softener. And sometimes this, with just a little bit of fiber or water, can actually, really help patients with constipation, but just in and of itself, it helps regulate. So, so that's a really nice, fun fact that I wanted to throw in there, even though it has nothing to do with osteoporotic fractures. It's just really nice piece for you guys to be aware of. So the Proton Support right now, they have a loyalty program that's going on. They have coupons, and this is in the kits. So you can ask for a kit in that survey window, which I don't know if any of you have filled out yet, because we're not quite done. But so the kits look like this, if you can see. So it comes actually in a box that looks like this, okay? And it just pops open. You can actually display this right in front of your desk with everyone, all your other brochures, or just put this brochure up here. And it has a little bit of information about the product itself that you can hand out, the coupons, and then it has one bottle, the one 30-day bottle of 60 capsules in there to try out. So if you want to just put this in your desk, so request this if you want through the survey, or you can email me if you decide to later. But you get these coupons, which are good until the end of December, and so you get $5 off your first 1 month supply, or if you subscribe to the auto delivery, you'll get $10 off. And so these are really, really good for the patients. My patients really like this, but you can only use this one on the ctherapeutics.com website. You can also buy the product from Amazon, and it's about, with the discount, it's actually cheaper through C Therapeutics, but those are the only two places that it's being sold at. So if you're getting it from somewhere else, I can't say that you're getting the same product. Those are the only two places, but c-therapeutics.com is where you will we will honor the coupons. Okay, so make sure to order your kits. We will also, which is very exciting, be getting some little patient packets. So you can actually request them, or we might send you some when they become available in a couple of months. So there'll be about 5 days worth of capsules that you can actually give to your patients, which is really great. So you'll be able to give them that, give them the coupons to take home so they can try it and then purchase them yourself. And we're working on some other programs as well to encourage your patients to utilize it as well while they're on their PPIs. Okay. Here's some cute little sayings I love just about prevention. So Proton Support is really something that you can go to when you're writing for your proton pump inhibitor. You're reviewing your patient's list of medications. You see they're on a proton pump inhibitor. You can give them one of the coupons or the samples when we have them available. Have them try. This is going to be prevention of those, particularly thinking about the patients who are at risk for osteoporosis or who have osteoporosis already. Okay. Again, it's for long-term treatment. Your patients who are on long-term PPI, you can use this indefinitely because of the modest amounts of the minerals and nutrients in there. We don't have to worry about overdosing. Okay. So if you have any questions for me, please email me at info@c-therapeutics.com. If you have any questions about the webinar, the product, any other clinical questions relating to my practice, myself, or PPIs, I'd be more than happy to respond to you. I do have this question and answer time. I don't know if I'm going to be able to actually get into it because I'm getting the signal that we're going to be closing up here right away. Let me see if I can at least get to one. Let's see here. Okay, I already talked about, yes, it can be used in treatment, but we did talk a little bit about that it's really more for prevention, but it can be used in supplementation, but you want to be monitoring and using other supplementations if you need to for any particular type of deficiency that's substantial. Let's see, is Proton Support supplement useful for postmenopausal women not taking PPIs? Well, you certainly could. I mean, there isn't any reason why you can't. It's just Proton Support is particularly made for people who are taking proton pump inhibitors because of the deficiencies. So if a patient of yours has a deficiency in one of those minerals, certainly you can take it. Or if you want her to just prevent her from developing that, you can certainly use it. But it's really more for the proton pump inhibitor itself. Okay, I think that's all that I have time for. Thank you so much. I will be going through these questions and responding to you personally at a later time. I do have to wrap up. I thank you all so much today for listening in. I hope this has been helpful and you'll be able to take it to your practice. Finish up those surveys, order your kits, wait for those samples to be sent to you, use those coupons, encourage those patients to use those coupons and subscribe to the loyalty program if they like the product, which I know they will. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.